So this is a really amazing example of storytelling where you took a subject that I'd never heard of this game, I'm not really into video games, but I really cared about your story. And why don't you guys talk about like how you guys like crafted this story?
Thank you. It's really ingratiating to hear that and to hear such a positive response to it. I felt like in the process of creating the documentary, I did a lot of research watching probably more documentaries than I'd ever seen before, especially on the subject of video games. And what I realized was that the ones which I found the least satisfying were ones that were really unconcerned with being accessible or meaningful to anyone who had no involvement in the original game. And something that had really occurred to me in my time playing it was its instantaneous appeal to someone who had never heard of it. So both for the reasoning of creating a film that was having some broad appeal and to recapture what the feeling was of playing the game, I was very adamant about trying to create an experience that was meaningful and accessible to people who had never heard of it before. And so I did a lot of testing with people who had never heard of the game, trying to make sure that it made sense to them, and a lot of rewriting to make sure you could get a basic understanding of it. And it seems to have been successful in that degree, so I'm very thankful for that.
So do you kind of consider yourself like a filmmaker first, and then you found this great subject, or a member of that community first, and then you decided to make a film to kind of document the community?
It's a really interesting question, because although I am a filmmaker, my primary background is in animation and narrative film, not so much in documentary. But being trained in live action film and being a member of the community during the time when the server was coming down, and I was realizing that, there were no other filmmakers in that community. And if I didn't take the time to record some of it, it would be a story completely lost to time, a story with relevance to any person in this modern commercial age who has to deal with obsolescence, planned or otherwise. And I felt that it would be a terrible shame if that were completely lost. What was your stance on it? You had a different background with the involvement, certainly.
Yeah, that's very true. Of course, I had not played Technika before. We are friends from film school. You were an undergrad when I was in grad at USC, both with some level of focus there on animation, but we met and worked together there in various student projects. But what I think was key to making this work, and it reflects very much on the idea of what kind of video game documentaries work and what kind of video game documentaries don't, is that the community, the people who love the game, became more and more central, especially after the decision to, decision's the wrong word, realization that the film was a feature and not a short, that really led us, and you in particular, I think once, this is your story. As a producer, it's very important to me to enable a story. I think the single biggest creative impact I had on the film was convincing you that it was in fact a feature. And once we made that decision and really let you open up the story of the community much more, because a short for a video game would often be much more preoccupied with just making the game tutorializing, for lack of a better word, explaining this is how the game works, especially for a game that was as unique and as groundbreaking as Technika was. But once we had that time, it's like, this is the game, this is what's great about it, and these are all the people who became, community friends, even in many cases, as we saw family playing it. I don't want to just throw shade at another film, but if you want an example of a video game documentary, which in my opinion does everything wrong, it's Video Game the Movie. If you've ever tried to watch it, and try is an operative word, it falls completely into tutorializing not just one game, but video games. And if you're not interested in games, it's just impenetrable. And if you're interested in games, it's condescending. Because it's like, and this is how Donkey Kong works. It's like, okay, and why should I care? And this is how Pac-Man works. It's like, I don't care. It's like, you know. So, you know, once we had the space really to make that decision, and we were able to find, you know, everything you loved both about the game and the community and about telling a good story, and we grew from there. The other key, though, I think, was music, because music is obviously at the center of Technika, but there were, I think, some key challenges in capturing that in a documentary, which I think you really worked with our composers more than I did, and I think you have some interesting angles on that experience.
Yeah.
If you want to expand on that a bit.
Only briefly, of course. But anyone here who's a Technika fan will quickly realize that there's almost none of the original music, and this is mostly related to licensing issues, that the few songs we did license came at great expense, and the vast majority were simply unavailable to be licensed because the Korean company which made the game, which owns the licenses, just isn't interested in talking to anyone who can't speak Korean and be present in Korea. At least that was our understanding of the situation. So we were sort of forced to rely not so much on recreations, but on finding people who had a sort of background in games, and rhythm gaming in particular, and would be open to taking this kind of musical language and adopting it to our emotional needs. A bunch of different people working on the same movie, and in a certain way it also reflects how Technika worked, since it too is a collaboration of several different composers and artists, and so for that, I think it came out surprisingly well.
Yeah, I'd add to that I think a great compliment that we've received from audiences who were Technika virgins. So not many of you who have come out tonight, and thank you so much for coming out tonight. Is a lot of them thought that the score of the film was music from Technika, and you know, when we would hear that, we're like, great. Perfect. Well, well done, team, on that. And you know, it was interesting though, because with although I also have a primarily narrative and fiction background and goals along those lines in film in general, my next project is actually another documentary feature about a music collective in Brooklyn, New York called Apartment Sessions, and the thing is they're a group who construct these not small, they construct a rather big multi-genre orchestra, like 30, 40, 60 musicians into like 1,000 square foot or less Brooklyn apartment or a rooftop or a subway car, and they play arrangements of their own songs, but also a lot of arrangements and compositions of covers of known bands and stuff. So with that, you know, it's actually a situation where I'm going into that project, and it's like we have to raise all this money because we can't avoid using the music. You know, we need to license it that way, and it's kind of
Wish you were back here.
well, no, but it's interesting how music is central to both of these documentaries that I've ended up working on in succession, but the challenges involved are quite different. In Touching Sound, we ended up using, as I'm sure you guys noticed, for sizable parts of the film, 4 songs from the game. 2 of those were essentially used as just soundtrack, stuff that, you know, played as background, and then 2 of them were used for analysis either of how the game works or how composing a very particular thing, how designing a boss song for a music game works. So, you know, those were ones where we're like, okay, these are fair use, we're constructing around, but the other ones were like, these are soundtrack. So, you know, we can't just go, we need to get it done. And those challenges are a big part of not only documentary filmmaking, but filmmaking in general and independent filmmaking in particular, because movies are expensive.
Do you guys have any questions?
Or we can go all night.
Yeah.
I had never heard of this game. I thought you did a very good job showing me how it works.
Thank you.
And all the stuff about it, I liked your mention of the EFF because they should get more mention.
Very good
All
people.
that they do. And this issue of these games that we have a community around, and then the manufacturers just go, there's no longer a useful business venture. But this we found a way to sort of keep it together, dealing with marketing issues and other stuff that go on. But I like that sense of the community as well, and that's part of the stuff I really liked the most was here's this cool game, but here's these people who are finding each other and enjoying it and playing roulette, which I thought was just goofier than hell, but delightful.
It was definitely, I think, some of our stance on that as well. But like my first time seeing the game really was walking in with a friend, and this group there I didn't know, of course, was doing this roulette. And, oh, hey, come join us. And I'm like, I've never touched this thing before. No, like it had that energy about it, and it's certainly something that I'd always felt had to be the emotional core of the film, that its appeal was community based, and I always found that really interesting. As to the EFF, it's also kind of, we did a long interview with Mitch over there, and he had a lot of good things to say. And of course, this was produced over years. At the time we were talking to him, of course, it was not 2015, and that feels like it's all so far behind us, but now it's already 2018, and it's gonna have to get renewed. And at some point we'll have to follow up with him and see what happens. I mean, the political climate is certainly different, I'm sure we're all aware, but but it brings to light that even these solutions are so fleeting and temporary. What does that say about the things they're meant to protect? And there's so many other much more well-known games and just parts of media that this will happen to. And I wish we'd been able to bring that notion even more to the fore, but I'm glad that's resonated with you.
Actually, I think that this really works. That this is really about the community, and yes, there are larger issues, and you sort of touched on some of those, but really you brought that right back to there's a group of people who are deeply connected to each other. In the car when they're driving from New York to New Jersey of all things, like I would sit right here. This is so nostalgic. I like the human stories.
Did you get any pushback from people revealing their identities as far as the private server clone and stuff?
There's actually some interesting.
Yes, we were very cautious about that. We were very much of the mindset that we didn't want to reveal his privacy if he was concerned. And it's weird, the middlemen were a lot more concerned about it than he was. Like the people who were getting us in touch with him were like, I don't know if he's going to be. And when we finally got to him, he was like, oh, what? I wouldn't say he's like, I don't care. He was aware of the legal ramifications, but he was actually very forthcoming. We even filmed a version where we went out of our way not to really show his face, and
the mystery interview.
Yeah, and everyone kind of felt awkward about it, and so
it felt unnatural.
When the issue was cleared in the Congress, we were very glad that he came out and said, yeah, show my face, it's fine. And but in the end, we still, of course, didn't use his full real name. The people who know him find that it's not hard to figure out who he is, of course, but it's very much with his permission. He's been incredibly accommodating about it all. Though I will say there's definitely parts of that discussion which aren't in the documentary, not just because it's like sketch or something like that, mostly because it's so technical that almost no one would be interested. But there's a lot of interesting things that had gone into what he ended up doing. He's a person with a lot of ingenuity. It was very interesting.
He's reverse engineering some other server that he never worked on. That he had to figure out how to write the code to do all of that. And yes, I'm probably the only one in the room who would find that interesting. But thank you.
All right, maybe one more question. One more. I know, so you guys were really focused on some romantic couples in the film, and was that something that came about in the writing and the pre-planning, or more in the editing, where you realized that those interviews were really substantial. You want to focus on that.
Well, I mean, we always knew that couples existed. In fact, another thing I feel like it would have been nice to better capture was the extent to which the community in its heyday was surprisingly, balanced in a male to female ratio, more so than a lot of other games in its environment in its time. And so it was always something that we felt would be important. But an interesting point it brings up is just how much the project had evolved when we started editing it. I would say that 90% of it was written in the editing room. There were, just vague attempts to start outlining it. It almost didn't pan out in any way, shape, or form. So much was dependent on what people said specifically. Because we made the choice not to use a narrator as much as we could to try and have it be the story of the community as told by the community, there are so many parts where, after the arduous task of getting it all transcribed, you'd look for a good line. And you'd find it, and you'd listen to it, and you'd say, oh, this guy sounds really bored, we can't use that line, even though what he said is good, And then you'd have to find another person who said it differently out of like 30 different transcripts, and they're all an hour long. It was an arduous task that took about a little over a year. And, the first cut was 2.5 hours long, now it's 75, and a lot of work went into that. And part of that was realizing where the couples fit, less so than if they did. I think everyone was really interested in that. Everyone liked that couple particularly, but the task was figuring out how to smoothly transfer into it and how to get out of it. And once we had that, it was just clear that it would go.
Cool. All right. So, thank you guys so much for coming out. Tech Docs 2018. Tomorrow, another entire crazy full day of films. And something of note is at 1 o'clock, Philip Shane, who's our special guest of the festival this year, is doing a masterclass. He has a 25-year career as a documentary filmmaker. His kind of biggest film was Being Elmo, about the guy that plays Elmo on the Sesame Street thing, and it was a Sundance Award-winning film. Absolutely free, just kind of show up and check out the class, and then films all day long, culminating in a big fun party and award ceremony at the end of the night, which is also free if you just want to come by for the award ceremony and party. So, all right, we'll definitely see you guys there, right? Yeah, absolutely. All right, thanks so much. And